Look at these compounds. These are different salts. Potassium sulfate, sodium sulfate, calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, copper sulfate, sodium chloride, sodium nitrate, sodium carbonate, ammonium chloride. Now we know that a salt is formed when an acid and a base come together and there is a neutralization reaction resulting in the formation of salt and water. Now can you try and write the formulae for these salts? Try to write it in your notebook. Once you have done it, you can pause the video and check it from here whether you have written it correctly or not. So potassium sulfate has a formula of K2SO4. Sodium sulfate has a formula of Na2SO4. Calcium sulfate CaSO4. Magnesium sulfate MgSO4. Copper sulfate CuSO4. Sodium chloride is NaCl. Sodium nitrate is NaNO3. Sodium carbonate is Na2CO3. And ammonium chloride is NH4Cl. Now, as I already told you that all these salts, that is each of these salts is formed by the reaction of an acid and a base. So, let us see what are the different acids and bases which combine together to form each of these salts. So, if you look at potassium sulfate, K2SO4, it is formed by a potassium ion and sulfate ion. So, potassium ion comes from the base potassium hydroxide and sulfate ion, sulfate radical comes from the acid sulfuric acid. So, from sulfuric acid, sulfate radical comes and from potassium hydroxide, the potassium radical will join together to form potassium sulfate. Similarly, for sodium sulfate, so the sodium ion comes from the base sodium hydroxide and sulfate ion once again comes from sulfuric acid. Calcium sulfate is another salt. So, calcium ion comes from base calcium hydroxide and sulfate ion comes from the acid sulfuric acid. Magnesium sulfate MgSO4. So, magnesium ion comes from the base magnesium hydroxide and sulfate ion once again comes from sulfuric acid, and we can see these ions combine together to give us this salt. Copper sulfate. So, the ion of copper ion comes from the base copper hydroxide and sulfate ion comes from sulfuric acid. Sodium chloride. So, the sodium ion comes from the base sodium hydroxide and chloride ion comes from the acid hydrochloric acid. Sodium nitrate. So, sodium ion comes from the base sodium hydroxide and nitrate ion comes from the acid nitric acid. Sodium carbonate. Once again, the sodium ion is obtained from the base sodium hydroxide and carbonate ion is obtained from carbonic acid. Ammonium chloride. So, the ammonium ion is obtained from ammonium hydroxide, which is a base, and chloride ion is obtained from the acid hydrochloric acid. Now, remember, this can also be formed by ammonia, which is a gas, by ammonia gas and hydrochloric acid. Ammonia gas is also a weak base and this gas dissolves in water to form the base ammonium hydroxide. Now, can you answer this question? The salt ammonium chloride can be prepared by which of the following acids? Is it hydrochloric acid, nitric acid or sulfuric acid? Now as we can see, the ion present here is the chloride ion. So it can be prepared by using the hydrochloric acid, HCl. So the chloride ion comes from the hydrochloric acid. Now just like you have a family and you live with your family, and you and your family might have certain common features or certain common habits, similarly the salts also have their families depending on common radicals or common ions. So radicals or ions. If the salts have some common radicals or common ions, we can say that they belong to that particular family. So for example, the sodium family, these are the salts belonging to the sodium family. Sodium sulfate, sodium chloride, sodium nitrate and sodium carbonate. All these salts have sodium as the common ion. Let us look at another family. This is the sulfate family. Potassium sulfate, sodium sulfate, calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate and copper sulfate. Each of these salts have sulfate as the common ion. So these belong to the sulfate family. Let us look at one more family, the chloride family. So sodium chloride, ammonium chloride. These two salts have the chloride ion as the common link. So as the common ion or the common radical. So these belong to the chloride family. So these were some of the salts, their formulae, the acids and bases which combine together to form these salts, and the families to which these salts belong.